son has an educational diagnosis of ASD and speech language impairment. School system wants to add intellectual disability based upon the results of the assessment they conducted for his triennial evaluation. You do not believe currently available IQ tests are valid measures of intellectual disability of a child with autism, especially those with speech and language impairments. We absolutely agree on that. On top of it, he also shows signs of ADHD, which we parents suspect that the school has also noted in their evaluation, although they are not proposing to add a diagnosis to his IEP on that. I don't know where you live, but if your child already has a diagnosis, educational diagnosis, and I'm glad you clarified, because a lot of parents don't know the difference between, sort of an educational diagnosis. There is a diagnosis, and then what would be considered a medical or a minimum requirement of your state education department to qualify under the autism category for IEP services. All right. So it doesn't mean that the child does not have autism. It just means that, according to the minimum requirements of your state for autism to qualify for an IEP, there could be a slight variation. Why? Because there could be a determination your child doesn't require specialized instruction, even though they have a diagnosis. You clarified. So an educational diagnosis of autism and speech language impairment on top of it. And I love that you reference your son's age of 14, because later in, that he's a kid with scattered abilities, difficult to define, bright in many areas. School is pushing for the ID diagnosis or the ID category. We have requested an IEE, but we live in a remote area and are having a hard time finding a competent evaluator. Your questions are this: why is the school pushing for this additional diagnosis? Do you know of cases where parents have been able to fight the school successfully on this issue, and how? One reason we don't want this diagnosis added to his IEP is that we are trying to get our child back on a diploma path. The school essentially told us that to get him on a non-diploma path, and he is not accessing the general education curriculum. Currently in a life skills classroom because no other option was made available to us. Yeah, I mean, you're right to worry about it. And no, your question is not convoluted. You basically answered your own question with number one, why is the school pushing for the additional diagnosis or the additional category, to making that the primary category? Because there's only a couple of ways to keep a kid out of, let's say, general education, or let's say justify that they can't be on a regular diploma path and they need to be on let's say, a non-diploma path, or a certificate of attendance or participation. And that is if the child is classified as severely cognitively disabled. Now, how do you achieve or determine severely cognitively disabled? Well, an IQ measure. That is the most common one, and that is a score of 55 or below. But you're exactly right. You give the child a normative, let's say, IQ assessment that doesn't take into consideration most traditional IQ measures are going to be heavily reliant on a child's language and communication skills. And they have nonverbal IQ measures, but at the same time, those aren't necessarily reliable when it comes to certain disability categories. And quite frankly, I don't think they're reliable pertaining to educational planning anyway, period. They're only used in education as determiners for categories. For, let's say, speech language or a specific learning disability, if you're using the discrepancy standard, then you have, the IQ measure, which then, gives you a predicted achievement, and then you compare it with the achievement results, and then it kicks out, a standard deviation. If it's a 16-point spread or more in most states, then the child magically has a specific learning disability. That's if you use a discrepancy model. That's where an IQ would be, that or an intellectual disability. And depending on your state, it usually falls in line with whatever your developmental disability or intellectual disability threshold is, which is usually around 70 or 69. But in education, severely cognitively disabled is a different threshold, and that is a 55 or below. I don't know what how your son scored on their IQ measure, but that would be their high motivation as to why. They're both related. It's the diploma pathway, it's his age, it is the placement with regards to the diploma path. And I can tell you, I have a case currently to where we're going to get it resolved, and I had another one. I don't know. I'd have to say last year, very similar to where the school put, based upon the IQ measure and determining, especially the one I had last year, to where they were just able to squeeze in a 55 on the IQ measure. And we had another one done, and he was, I don't know, a few points above that. And, my thing is, who cares? And it doesn't matter. Your child has eligibility years, all right, up until 21. And if it takes him until 21 on a regular diploma path or even a mid-range path, if your state has one, let's say an occupational type diploma, then it's none of their business. It's none of the education system's business at that point to sit there and determine and control or dictate and limit your child's ability to attempt those diploma pathways. Yet I see schools try to do that all the time. Now, does that mean that as your child ages out at 21 that they leave with nothing? They already put him on a path of nothing. And that is just a diploma of, I was here every day. I participated. So you see where the fallback, if he was to exit at 21 and wasn't able to achieve the highest diploma or the mid-range diploma, then the fallback would be the certificate of attendance, that I was there, I was present. Because the threshold for that is nothing. That's the diploma my daughter's going to get, and I'm a realist about that. She can't complete either of those two, but it doesn't sound like your son is in the same category, and so at that point, yes, and it doesn't mean that you can't adjust and make these combinations to where your son spends time in general education, maybe hammers out 1 or 2 credit-based classes per semester. Your child's there until he's 21. You can utilize that time. And you can sit there and string out those classes. And if your son ends up getting a D in those classes, it's passing. As we have kids that are pushed through the education system because of environmental factors, because of how the neighborhood that they grew up in, the poverty conditions that they're in, that don't have disabilities, but yet the system pushes them and pushes them and pushes them, and they push them out of the system, and they get regular diplomas, and many of them totally ill-equipped for society. So I don't want to hear the education system say that we love your child so much that we don't want to make it hard on him, so therefore we're going to sit there and just lean over for the easiest, rottenest fruit on the ground instead of raising the bar and giving him an opportunity, giving him the opportunity that he wants and that you want for him. How dare they decide what they want for your son? This is where they don't have a choice, guys. They don't get to sit there and dictate what diploma path your son gets to try. All right? They don't get to dictate that. That's why they have to make it very clear. And that's why they're pushing so hard for the intellectual disability label, so that they can sit there and bolster their decision that your son can't because your son's severely cognitively disabled. I'd love to know where you live, because if it's in any of the states where we practice, hell, I'll jump on that. I'll jump on that all day long. You're right for asking the questions, and you're right for pushing back. Something is amiss, man. You figured it out. And this is where you stand firm for your son.